Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, I'm titling the video "The Big Mistake," and the reason I'm calling it the big mistake is there seems to be the thought process that if open hostilities break out between NATO and the Russian Federation, obviously over the current Ukrainian conflict, that we would probably see NATO forces very quickly and very rapidly seize control of Kaliningrad, the Kaliningrad region. So the Kaliningrad region is this area here. It is in between Lithuania and Poland, and it does not have at this point direct access to Russian territory, meaning the closest Russian satellite or area where Russia could compile forces is in Belarus to the east, roughly as a bird flies, about 50 miles from the Kaliningrad and then the Belarusian border. But again, it would appear that some of the thought process is that if the balloon does go up, then obviously if we start to see NATO, United States, and Russian forces start to engage in conflict, we would possibly see a Polish or joint, possibly Polish-U.S. move into Kaliningrad. And I have seen some comments that would indicate, at least in the comment section for this channel, that the Poles and the U.S. forces would rapidly seize control of the Kaliningrad region. So what protects Kaliningrad in terms of Russian forces? So right now, the Russians have positioned in Kaliningrad, and we don't believe any of these forces are currently being used in the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. And that consists of the 11th Army Corps, and that falls under the command of the Baltic Sea Fleet. And the main force is a relatively a new force. It's the 18th Mechanized Division. It's an understrength mechanized division, we believe, still forming. And then there is an additional a mechanized regiment that also is based near the city of Kaliningrad. So in terms of ground forces, you have within the 18th Mechanized Division, you have a mechanized regiment with 3 motorized rifle battalions and 1 tank battalion. Then you have an attached tank regiment with 3 tank battalions and 1 motorized rifle regiment. And additionally, you have a independent motorized rifle regiment with another 3 motorized rifle battalions and a tank battalion. And then you also have a reconnaissance battalion attached to the 18th Mechanized Division. You have a independent artillery brigade that is based in Kaliningrad. You have elements of an understrength naval infantry brigade, anywhere from 2 to 3 naval infantry battalions plus or minus. And you also have some naval special forces capability. And then you also have National Guard units and Russian paramilitary units also operating in Kaliningrad. And you also have a Skander brigade as well, which would bring an immediate capability of Russian forces to strike deep inside of Poland and even quite possibly hit Berlin if needed, depending on the types of weapons the Skander was armed with. But the concept that we would see a maneuver force of NATO entering the Kaliningrad area, I think is fairly remote. I do think NATO forces would see fairly significant casualties by moving into Kaliningrad, especially as it got closer to the main city, and urban fighting would start to take place. And in all likelihood, NATO forces would experience a lot what Russian forces are now experiencing in its campaigns against the Ukrainians. and obviously there are towns and villages all inside of Kaliningrad. It's open fields and forests, and it would be a real challenge for NATO forces to seize control of Kaliningrad. And on top of that, once Russia realized what was happening, the Russians would probably go into a win-hold-win strategy where they would be looking at holding current areas in Ukraine and shifting forces for a rapid movement into the Baltic states. And obviously that would lead to a all-out conflagration between NATO forces and Russian forces. We would probably see very quickly a NATO degrade and destroy Russian aircraft capability in terms of air forces based in Kaliningrad, and we've seen that it's quite possible that Russia would have some challenges with existing stealth capabilities if they were deployed against Kaliningrad. But in terms of maneuver forces of NATO entering Kaliningrad, that's really where NATO would run into problems, probably very, very quickly. And I don't think you would see this rapid advance where NATO would seize control of all of Kaliningrad relatively quickly. There would be very brutal, tenacious fighting taking place throughout the region as Russian forces mount defensive operations. But at the same time, eventually Russia at that point would have to fully mobilize and be looking to enter Lithuania and then eventually connect Kaliningrad with Russian forces, with external forces moving through Belarus, and then quite possibly large forces moving against Estonia and Latvia as well. And then obviously we would be looking at World War III ultimately at that point. So probably unlikely scenario at this point, but as the war could possibly escalate, is it impossible? No, it's not. It's a very real possibility that what's happening right now in Ukraine could escalate. Obviously, I would say at this point the Russian surface fleet, there's much to probably be desired in terms of the Russians having the capability to occupy Gotland Island or some other areas in the Baltics. I would say that is probably fairly remote at this point, but at the same time, I think we would see some subsurface activity by the Russian Navy in terms of its diesel electric submarines and nuclear attack submarines and cruise missile submarines as well, going after NATO targets. And then obviously Russian cruise missile attacks, Iskander missile attacks, ballistic missile attacks on targets in the NATO sphere would absolutely happen. And I can tell you that would lead to a general collapse in the world economy, especially if maritime assets start to be attacked by Russian subsurface assets as well. And is there a possibility that Russia starts to go after oil platforms in the North Sea and other assets to kind of create this environment where we have economic calamity in the West, which I believe the United States is very susceptible to at this point. And I think that's ultimately what the West would be trying to avoid is this economic catastrophe that would naturally occur. At the same time, I don't believe Germany would enter into the conflict. Germany would look to do everything in its power to avoid a direct engagement with Moscow, and obviously that leads to other issues within NATO as well. But the concept that NATO could rapidly and quickly seize control of Kaliningrad, don't think so. There could be some, obviously, NATO could enter Kaliningrad. They could take some areas in Kaliningrad, but a move on the main city, I do think they would eventually get bogged down. And quite honestly, the fighting would at some point start to look exactly like what the Russians are dealing with now. And that would probably spur on the Russian population again to kind of go into this total war mode and the Russian military would fully mobilize. They may start receiving direct support from China, and obviously Belarus would also join the fighting directly as well, and we would probably start to see fighting directly along the Polish-Belarusian border as well, and this would just really become a complete and utter just a really nasty, brutal conflict that in terms of propensity for casualties and taking casualties, I don't think the West is there. I think the West would grow very, very quickly in terms of the unattractiveness of the amount of casualties on the ground that the United States would start to sustain and see against fighting Russian forces actually on the ground. Obviously, yeah, the air component would come into play and would not help the Russians at all. And in all probability, we'd start to see NATO units move into Ukraine and a general offensive by the Ukrainian military against Russian forces in the east as well. But as the conflict would progress, as Russia would mobilize, the dynamics of the conflict could start to change and wear the West out, especially in terms of taking casualties. Harken back to World War II. In the early stages of Barbarossa, the British Ministry of Defense really believed that the Russian forces, the Soviet forces, would crumble and Moscow would eventually be seized. And that was not a very good prediction, because obviously the Russian forces were able to recover. Yes, there was a lend-lease to Russia, and that did help the Russians out, but by and large, the Russians did a lot of what they did on their own. Obviously, they did receive support from the West in terms of that lend-lease component, but I feel that China would kind of replace the West and that total war lend-lease type of support towards the Russian Federation in the event that total hostilities were to break out. So no, I don't believe Kaliningrad would be quickly seized by the West, and I also believe that economic conditions would really cause the West to rethink and have the ability to conduct offensive operations against Russia. And just wanted to talk about that real quick and open that up for discussion. And feel free to comment. Thanks again for joining us. Have a great day.